Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm here with Dan Norton with his channel with, I think it's titled with his name, or is it The Selfishness Project? But yeah, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. So I'm Dan Norton, and as Garrett just said, I have a channel on YouTube as well as a website called The Selfishness Project, where I explore the idea of selfishness from the perspective of Ayn Rand's philosophy, and I have conversations with people as a way to do that exploration. Before I started my channel, I was in graduate school for philosophy, just finished my PhD a few months ago, and got a master's in philosophy before that, bachelor's in philosophy before that. I was in the Objectivist Academic Center for several years in their undergraduate and graduate programs. I worked at ARI for a few years as well. And I think, so I just did a kind of reverse chronological history for you. So there's my last, I don't know how many years in a nutshell.
Yeah, interesting. And then I actually found out about you after I recorded my life and happiness video, and then you commented under there, basically asking some questions about it, challenging me a little bit on some of the statements that I made. And yeah, I thought it would be good to have you come on rather than just like continuing like a whole essay back and forth and like actually getting to the root of these issues. Because I noticed that a lot of times in internet comment sections, it's like this sort of just talking past each other sometimes, or it's just walls of text back and forth, and it's like that. It usually doesn't end up being as productive as a face-to-face conversation. So then I guess I just reached out to you via email, and here we are talking about this now. I guess, should I lay out my position first, or yeah, I'll probably do that. So I guess my essential position on this issue would be, um, so fundamentally, the foundations of Rand's ethics would be this whole question of, it starts with the whole like question of why do we need ethics, and then for a living organism, you have the fundamental alternative of life or death, and Rand's ethics sort of goes after you, or continues after you choose life, and then the question comes, what are your requirements for life? And then you base your values off of that. So I guess the question for me that has kind of gone in my mind is, why do we choose life instead of death? What is the reason for that? And my I guess my goal with making that video is to sort of explain that and make it so that it's not an arbitrary choice. Because if that's an arbitrary choice, sort of the foundation of Rand's ethics would be arbitrary. And that's something that I want to avoid.
Yeah, first let me just say that I think this is a tricky issue,
Mm-hmm.
and there's been a lot written about it. Over the last few days, I was reading several articles and chapters about this very issue of the fundamental choice in ethics to live or not, and how exactly should we understand that choice? Is it an arbitrary choice? Is it subjective? And it's only after you made a certain choice that we can say it's objectively right to pursue one thing rather than the other, but the primary choice itself is not something you can criticize someone for. It's only after you've made that primary choice that it makes
Mm-hmm.
sense to then offer criticisms of what someone might go on to choose to do. But the primary choice itself, since it is primary, does it really make sense to say you should do one rather than the other? On what basis would you decide that? Isn't the whole idea of getting a basis for evaluating choices, the whole idea of having a basis at all already presuppose that you've made a choice one way on that fundamental choice?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are differences of opinion in the objectivist literature or the secondary literature. And like Alan Godhell, for instance, he has just looking at he has a piece that came out in 1990 responding to Douglas Rasmussen at a Ayn Rand's Society meeting. This is a group associated with the American Philosophical Association, and Douglas Rasmussen had been arguing for a certain position on this issue of, is there an obligation, a moral obligation to make the primary choice to live And I think he was arguing that there was, and Alan was arguing that there was not. But then Alan changed his views over the years, and his view is now more in line with a position that Darrell Wright holds. And the first essay in this book, the Ayn Rand Studies Philosophical Series, has put out a series of books, the first one of which is on ethics. And the lead essay in this book is an essay by Darrell Wright on this very issue, how to understand the primary choice, whether there's some kind of moral obligation. And Alan has said that his view is now more in line with Darrell's. And there's been other discussions as well, but that's some of what I've been reading over the last few days. And maybe we can get into some of the, bring in some of their ideas insofar as I understand them. But it is a tricky issue, and I don't claim myself to have it all perfectly worked out. My thinking has been evolving over the last few days in particular as I've been reading through some of this literature, but hopefully together we can make some progress in trying to get a better handle on this issue.
Yeah, for sure. This is definitely a very tricky issue in Rand's ethics, and it's definitely not, it's something that it's not necessarily something that she like fully seemed to work out in her ethics. She might, she didn't seem to like fully work out why we make that choice to live, or if it's like exactly a choice that we need to make or need to have a basis for. And I guess fundamentally, I think that it is a choice that we do need to have a basis for, because I think we can inductively see that life is good, that there are good things in life. And because of that, because life is good, because of the good things that we can achieve during life, we can say that that choice to live is not an arbitrary choice, and it ultimately would be a good choice to make. That's a sort of essentialized summary of my position from my thinking on this issue, I guess. And what specifically would be those positions that they talked about in those essays? 'Cause I'm not familiar with those essays that you talked about.
What are their positions? Well, I'm not super familiar with their positions. I mean, I've read through the essays at least once, but there's a lot there to think over. But to take Darrell Wright's position, as I understand it, he says that there is grounds for making the primary choice to live, but what he calls it is a non-deliberative grounds. So I think maybe what that means is there's not like an explicit reason, some thought in your mind in terms of propositional content. He uses that phrase, like explicit words, like I should live because if I do so, then I have a shot at being happy. Like those words that I just uttered would not be in someone's mind as they're making the choice to live, but there's something implicit that corresponds to those words. I don't know if you would want to just call that a feeling, but or a sense that somebody has. But there is something, a non-deliberative grounds. So maybe another way of putting that is an implicit grounds for making the choice one way. And that's what grounds the choice to live. And that's what makes it rational to condemn someone who chooses otherwise. Like James Taggart is an example that he gives of someone who doesn't choose to live. So I guess the idea is that James Taggart is, he has access to this implicit non-deliberative grounds for choosing to live, yet he doesn't act accordingly. He doesn't go after that. So that's at least part of Wright's view, Darrell Wright's view. I don't know if it's right to characterize that as an intrinsic reason to live. Like, is there something just intrinsically attractive about these non-deliberative grounds that makes it rational to choose those grounds? Now, of course, Ayn Rand, she distances herself from an intrinsicist position. Nothing is good in itself. It's always good to an agent for some purpose. So in some sense, her view is not intrinsic, but I've wondered, at least if Darrell Wright's interpretation of it is correct, is there some sense in which there is something that it's intrinsically appealing and that gives us grounds, gives us reason to pursue it just in itself? So that's at least a little bit of Darrell Wright's view on this issue, as I understand it. And it seems like Alan Gotthelf, he passed away, but I guess by the time the companion to Ayn Rand came out, this volume co-edited with Gregory Salmieri, he says there in a footnote, I think, that his current view then, I guess this would have been as of 2013, was more in line with Darrell Wright's view. There was another piece I came across recently by a guy named Ole Martin Moen from Norway, Norwegian philosopher, who's been influenced by objectivism. He has a piece in Reason Papers, which is free online, where he argues that happiness is the ultimate value rather than life. He doesn't engage with Darrell Wright's piece much directly, although he does cite it, so he's at least aware of it. But so his position is that it makes more sense for happiness to be the ultimate value, not necessarily the ultimate standard, but the ultimate value. And then David Kelly has a response piece to that, also in Recent Papers, a few years after that. And so Moen's piece was 2012, and then Kelly's response was 2015, arguing that actually life is properly regarded as the ultimate value, but then happiness it's not as distinct from life as Moen was making it out to be. And if you do make life and happiness out to be distinct in the way that Moen was, then I guess there's more reason to go with Moen and say happiness is the ultimate value. But if you see them as more integrated, maybe if you see happiness as an aspect of life, or of man's life qua man, then it makes more sense to think of life as the ultimate value. So that's a little about their views.
Yeah, I guess with my position on this, thinking about this, is just generally that, like, yeah, life and happiness are necessarily integrated, and that happiness is sort of the reward for achieving life. So, and that's sort of why we ultimately choose to live, because of that potential for happiness in life. Because if we live, we're going to be rewarded by happiness, and happiness is sort of this, I guess, state of non-contradictory joy. It's like you can't say that happiness is bad, but there's a sense in which you can say that like there's a sense in which you can say that living is bad if it doesn't bring you happiness. There's a sense in which you can say that, because like if you're in a concentration camp, for example, like there's no obligation to live, there's no duty to live. I would say that there's a sense in which that life wouldn't be the right choice to make in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a way you could look at it as a tragic affirmation of the choice to live, the choice to live qua man. So in the concentration camp, being able to live qua man, that's qua rational being who pursues this long run integrated kind of existence full of values like productive work and happiness. That's not an option that's on the table if you're in a concentration camp. So it's I don't know if it's right to say you're choosing not to live, or it's just that choosing to live is no longer an option in the sense that Rand means it as a value.
Yeah, for sure. So like Rand integrates life with happiness here. Like life and happiness are sort of necessarily connected, or life and your values. Like in sort of thinking about whether or not to like metaphysically live or metaphysically die, you're basically saying that, oh, life is where I can achieve my values, and these values are based off of like the pleasure that they bring, and ultimately the happiness that they bring, if they're consistent with your life. if that, or what, I guess what sort of is your take on that? Because we might have some disagreements here, because I know you had some disagreements with that formulation in my video.
Yeah, I think one place where I wasn't sure that I would agree with the formulation was, I mean, whenever you say we should choose to live, or we
Hmm.
ought to choose to live, or we must choose to live, any of those kinds of formulations,
Hmm.
I wonder if they're coherent, because life is what gives rise to shoulds and oughts and musts. There's no independent standard um, by reference to which we should or must or ought to pursue life itself. At least in certain moods, that's what I think makes sense. So there's a kind of incoherence to
Hmm.
saying that we should choose to live. Because my question then is, by what standard? Um, are you going to say by the standard of life? Okay, but we haven't chosen life yet.
Hmm.
Um, so it's, I mean, this, I could be misunderstanding Rand's view, but I'm not sure. But I mean, she does say things like all musts are conditional. There are no
Hmm.
categorical imperatives. There are only hypothetical imperatives. So you must do whatever if you want to
Hmm.
achieve some end. But there's
Yeah.
no just you must, full stop, period.
Hmm.
Um, Now, so if we apply that idea to the choice to live itself, if we're going to say you should or you must or you ought to choose to live, well, if what? How are we going to fill that in a way that's consistent with her view that all musts or shoulds or oughts are conditional? So here's the question. You must choose to live if fill in the blank.
Hmm.
What are you going to fill in that blank with? She
Yeah.
says
Huh. So
you've
I
got,
guess it's almost, I guess it's almost a question of like, should you choose to adopt immorality? That's kind of a broader thing, broader sense in which this applies. Should you choose to sort of like adopt a sort of guiding principle or a guiding system to your life, or should you live? And I guess the whole reason for that, the whole purpose of having a moral system, is to achieve happiness. That's what Rand says in The Virtue of Selfishness. I actually looked up a bunch of quotes um, last night to find this, and it's like she explains that life is the standard, and then happiness is sort of the purpose of ethics. But happiness can't be the standard. Happiness cannot be a standard, because if you take happiness alone as a standard, then you ultimately are led to hedonism. Because what do you base your happiness on? What standard do you base your happiness on? And basically when you don't do that, like, it's just pleasure for the sake of pleasure, and it's not based on life. It's not based on what's actually going to lead you to more sort of happiness in the future, more life in the future, I guess. I might be misinterpreting Rand's quote here, but I guess I have a copy where I underlined a bunch of stuff if we want to like look at it.
yeah, I just got out my copy too. Yeah, she
Mm.
does definitely draw a distinction between the standard and the purpose, but I find that I mean, there's some interpretive challenges here, because she does say, and maybe most of the time says, that life is the standard, or man's life is the standard, and happiness is the purpose. But she also
Mm.
says, at least in one place, that life is also the purpose, not happiness, but life. So
Mm.
this is looks like paragraph 58 of the Objectivist Ethics,
What page is
and
that on?
it's I guess a little over halfway through. She says the Objectivist Ethics holds man's life as the standard of value, and his own life as the ethical purpose of every
Mm.
individual man. So there, she's not saying happiness is the purpose. She's saying
Mm-hmm.
his own life is the purpose. Yet, elsewhere, she does say happiness is the purpose,
Mm-hmm.
like on paragraph 67, she says, to live for his own sake means that the achievement of his own happiness is man's highest moral purpose.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how do we integrate these two things? Maybe the idea is that happiness is like the psychological angle on life. So existentially, so here's skipping ahead a bit. She says the maintenance of life and the pursuit of happiness are not two separate issues. To hold
Mm-hmm.
one's own life as one's ultimate value and one's own happiness as one's highest purpose are two aspects of the same achievement. Existentially, the activity of pursuing rational goals is the activity of maintaining one's life. Psychologically, its results, reward, and concomitants is an emotional state of happiness. It is by experiencing happiness that one lives one's life in any hour, year, or the whole of it. And then she goes on. So maybe you can think of both life and happiness can be understood as the purpose
Mm-hmm.
of life, but one is the purpose considered from an existential point of view, and the other, happiness, is the
Mm-hmm.
purpose considered from a psychological point of view.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a way to integrate those
Mm-hmm.
two.
Yeah. So sort of like, I guess a way to formulate this that I'm kind of thinking of right now, like to exist, we need to maintain our own life. If we want to continue existing, you need to maintain your own life. Existentially, you need to maintain your own life. Um, and psychologically, like we do that for it, or we kind of live for a psychology of happiness. Like that's not a very clear formulation, I guess, but it's sort of the first quick explanation that comes to my mind. I don't know, when I try to learn stuff and try to integrate stuff, I like to just get out a quick formulation and then develop it from there. So if I'm sure you have criticisms of that formulation, but
I'm not sure. If you want to run it by me again, maybe I can.
yeah. So I guess sort of like, okay, so existentially we say I'll repeat the quote, I guess. Existentially, the activity of pursuing rational goals is the activity of maintaining one's life. So like sort of when I think of the word existentially, it's like, okay, in order to exist, like we need to maintain and pursue our own life. That might be a misrepresentation of the quote, but that's part of what I get out of the word like existentially. And then psychologically, like we do it for a psychological state, this reward of happiness. That's why we pursue our life, so that we can get this reward of happiness. Like we we continue existing, we continue living for a reward of life.
I think maybe the distinction here is like the inner and the outer perspective.
Mm.
So often she contrasts mind and body, or spirit and matter, that kind of idea, psychologically and existentially. So I think maybe that's the idea here, that existentially, like from a kind of outside perspective, um, man's life consists in pursuing rational goals.
Mm.
And then psychologically, the internal sort of perspective is that you're pursuing this happiness.
Mm-hmm.
That's one way you might try to relate. What is the relation of the existential and the psychological? Basically, that means the outer and the inner. Another way you might think of it, which I don't know if this is correct, but you might think of the psychological as an aspect of the existential. If you think of existence as like everything, and then,
Mm-hmm.
well, psychology is an aspect or a part of everything. So you might also think of this as a part-whole relationship rather than an inner-outer kind of relationship, or an
Mm.
aspect. And in, I don't know what, existence is not actually, not an entity, at least not in the normal sense of like,
Mm.
a rock.
Yeah.
But, so yeah, I think it's, I'm not exactly sure how to understand the kind of relationship she has in mind between existential and psychological. I think
Mm-hmm.
maybe the first I proposed, the inner versus the outer perspective, maybe that's the most plausible kind of distinction she's trying to get
Yeah.
at here.
Hmm. Oh yeah, that actually makes. I thought that mind-body formulation was a good one because it sort of ties into the whole idea of like how we integrate mind and body as objectivists. Like that's an important principle. And like you need to have both of these to have a to live qua man. To like live qua man, you need both life and happiness. And like there's a sense in which it's similar to like the existence consciousness sort of thing as well, because like if you want to achieve happiness you need to live. Like if you're dead you can't be happy, and to live qua man, to live as a human being, you live a happy life. That's part of what it means to live qua man, is to live and be happy. So like there's a sense in which these two things are integrated together in a similar way to how we integrate mind and body.
Yeah, although as you were just talking there, I thought, well, it's not quite like that, because mind and body are not. I mean, this gets into the philosophy of mind, which is actually what the area I focused on in my graduate school career. So there's this view of dualism, which is the idea that mind and body are distinct in some way. There's different kinds of dualism. There's what's called substance dualism. There's property dualism. And, but in any case, I think Rand is plausibly interpreted as some kind of dualist when it comes to mind and body, but I'm not sure she's a dualist when it comes to life and happiness in a similar kind of way. I think it might be that, as you were saying towards the end there, that happiness is part of life, or an aspect of life, but I don't think she would say that the mind is a part of the body or an aspect of the body. I
mean there's
At least I'm not sure she would say that. She might think that both are aspects of man. Like man is an entity, and then he has these two aspects: his physical aspect and his mental aspect, or his material part and his mental part, if you want to put it in terms of parts. But I think I suspect that might be a different kind of relationship than between life and happiness. So I'm not sure the analogy quite works, the mind and body. Maybe it works in some ways, but not others.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's that's how a lot of analogies generally tend to be, and it's usually when you try to like overextend an analogy, that's when you end up falling into, or when one tries to overextend an analogy, that's when they fall into rationalism. That's
Yeah, I mean,
often can be the case.
if it was a perfect analogy, it wouldn't really be an analogy.
Yeah, for sure.
I was thinking on the very point that we were using the analogy for, though, it might not work. But I'm not sure about that.
Yeah. Huh.
So I mean, what you were saying you liked the mind body analogy, and then so I guess you could, from what perspective did you like it?
Because there's a sense in which like part of Rand's philosophy is like integrating mind and body. That's like we can't like separate mind and body like what the rationalists and empiricists do. We integrate them together, like they're two aspects of a sort of whole, which is man. And that's sort of the same thing with like life and happiness. Like life is sort of this existential requirement, and we need to live to be happy, but we also need happiness as a sort of motivator to get us to choose to live. So they're sort of integrated in that sense.
Yeah, they're definitely integrated, but it's the way in which they're integrated that I think there's some kind of difference between mind and body on the one hand and life and happiness on the other. So I don't know if it's worth trying to pin down exactly what the difference is in the way they're integrated, but I suspect there is some kind of difference.
Yeah, most likely. Yeah, I don't know. I just thought it might be like sort of a useful analogy to think about, like because one thing that I think is really important in Rand's ethics is trying to integrate life and happiness rather than like sort of separating them out, because when you do separate them out, you get to this weird question of like which comes first, which is the primary, or should you pursue life at the expense of happiness, or should you pursue happiness at the expense of life? And those are incoherent questions, because happiness is a reward for living as a human being and achieving your values that are in accordance with your life. So you can't really separate life and happiness. And I guess more of what I'm trying to do is sort of pin down what specifically is that relationship. And I guess that's what my video was about. And sort of how I do it is I think of like, why fundamentally why am I living? Why don't I, like, I guess not to be morbid, like, why don't I just not live anymore? Why don't I just end my life? Well, then immediately there's like a flood of concretes that come into my mind of like, oh, friends, family, career, my YouTube channel, all these things that I love, all these values that come to my mind. And it's sort of, I guess there's a sort of thing of like, I want to live so that I can achieve these values and achieve the happiness that comes with these values. And I think that's the sense in which happiness is sort of the answer to this question of why do I choose to live in this fundamental alternative? It sort of explains why happiness is sort of this purpose of morality, when you think about it from that perspective.
Yeah, I think I mean, this was coming up some in the comment thread that we were where we were discussing this. I think that might separate happiness in life more than Rand sees them as being separated. When you say, I mean, you were saying that these values, your YouTube channel and your friends and so forth, are your reason for wanting to live. So now simultaneously, those constitute your life. So it's like the things which make up your life are also your reason for wanting to continue living. So it's like you're living for the sake of more living. And I guess maybe that gets it. This is a way of saying that life is an end in itself. It's its own end. It's a self-sustaining, self-generating process. It's pursued for its own sake. Now, happiness, I think, is also, it's kind of wrapped up with these activities. You enjoy your YouTube channel and so forth, as do I, and you want to get more of that. So it's, if you put it as like your reason for wanting to do these activities is so that you can get happiness, I wonder if that's kind of a way of saying like your reason for wanting to have happiness is so that you can get happiness, because happiness is already bound up with these activities. It's not something separate from them. And I mean, I don't know if you agree with that, but it's the way you're formulating it made me at least cautious, or in thinking that you are somehow separating happiness from the activities that give rise to or are associated with happiness. So I guess your idea is you need happiness as a kind of justifier. Like life is not its own justification. You need something in addition to life to justify the choice to live. That's what I'm not sure is right, that you need something in addition to life. Because if you already bake into the idea of life happiness is part of, or an aspect of life, then you don't need anything beyond life to justify the choice to live.
Yeah, so I guess if you formulate it that way, then you don't need happiness separate from it. Yeah, that makes sense. So like, but it's like the reason that you choose to live is because baked in that aspect of life is sort of this happiness. That's sort of how I think about it in that sense. Like, because like I like that formulation of like the reason you live is for living, because living, your life is your friends, your family, YouTube channel, career, yourself, like self-maintaining, those sort of things. like you're that's what your life is, and that sort of brings happiness, and like, and you're essentially living for those things, for those values, and those values being your life. So you're living for life as a sort of end in itself, and baked into this is happiness. And because your life brings you happiness, you choose to live. I mean, that seems to be what this formulation is implying, but I think, yeah.
It's so the formulation being, so your formulation is the reason to live is because it brings, or at least potentially brings.
Oh, wait, you cut out for a second. Sorry.
Is the formulation you just referred to the idea that the reason to live is because it brings at least possibly happiness?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, maybe there's a sense or angle from which I would agree with that, but I mean, does it also seem right to say the reason to live is so that you can live more? Like, could you also put it in terms of
Yeah.
life as its own justification?
Yeah. There's yeah, that makes sense, because like you're like, when you think about why am I living, going back to the whole values thing, like, why am I living? Because of the values, the friends, family, career, YouTube, those sort of things. And that you sort of encapsulate it as that's also life. Like, you're living for life as a justification in itself. So there's a sense in which you, like, life is an end in itself in that sense. That's why I think that actually brings more clarity for me when thinking about that quote that you brought up earlier, like, um, man's life is a standard of value, and his own life is his, like, purpose, or whatever the specific quote was, if you know which one I'm referring
Yeah.
to. So yeah, I guess that's the sort of sense in which life is an end in itself, um, because you want to live to be able to continue living, to continue pursuing those things. But I guess the question that I always think of is like, okay, is life good though? Is life a good thing? And the answer to that is yes, because baked into life, baked into living, for like your reward for continually living is happiness.
Yeah. So I wonder if this implies that in some sense life is intrinsically of value. If by life here we mean at least partly a life involving happiness,
Mm-hmm.
um, is that is it right to say that's intrinsically worth pursuing? I mean, there is an agent. It's If it is intrinsically
Mm-hmm.
worth pursuing, I would want to say it's intrinsically worth pursuing for the agents.
Yeah.
Um, so it's not intrinsic in the sense that it's like mind independent or agent independent. But is there something? Does it seem right to say that it's intrinsically worth pursuing this life of happiness, or should we? Is there some
Hmm.
danger in saying that it's intrinsically worth pursuing, or an intrinsic value? Should we just say it's a value in itself, or, well, when you
Yeah.
say in itself, that's kind of another way of saying intrinsic. But
Yeah.
should we just say it's a value, or it's worth pursuing, as opposed to intrinsically a value or intrinsically worth pursuing? That's
Hmm.
one question I have. I mean, I
Yeah.
feel I feel some temptation to use this term intrinsic for some reason, uh, but I don't know if that would create some kind of problem.
Yeah. I'm not. Hmm. I mean,
I
there's a
mean, does
sense
it
in
seem
which,
problematic to you at all to use this term intrinsic?
yeah, I don't like the term intrinsic just because of all of the implications it has in philosophy, but it there feels like there's a sense in which it's not a bad thing. Like, there's a sense in which, for this specific context, like, a life of happiness is not, like, I can't think of a way in which that could be bad or not good inherently, like, in and of itself, like, as an end in itself. because you sort of have to philosophically have an end in itself somewhere, like if you want to avoid infinite regress. I guess that's really a really rationalistic formulation there, but um
Yeah, this idea of um, happiness or a life of happiness being an end in itself or something worth pursuing for its own sake. I wonder if these formulations like end in itself, I mean, in itself, that sounds kind of like intrinsic,
hmm,
or it makes me think of intrinsic or for its own sake. It's like not for the sake
yeah,
of anything else, but the thing itself, for its own
hmm,
sake. It's worth pursuing for its own
yeah,
sake. I mean,
hmm,
that's where this idea of it, I think that's why the idea of intrinsic is coming to mind. And it seems like maybe
yeah,
it's another way of formulating these ideas of something being worth pursuing for its own sake or being an in itself. Um,
hmm.
isn't
Well,
that kind?
hmm, I guess when I think of intrinsic, I sort of think like apart from a consciousness, apart from a value, or apart from a human. Like when you're thinking of, well, like an intrinsic value, for example, like let's say, I don't know, shoot, now nothing's coming to mind. Oh,
The
let's say the
environment.
environment. Yep, environment. There we go. That's the easy one. The environment is
Oh,
apart from human beings. Well,
you
like
cut out
that's,
for a second.
oh, oh yeah. So let's say the environment is an intrinsic value apart from human beings. Like that's an example of an intrinsic value because it's like apart from the mind and it's just intrinsically valuable within and of itself, like to some people, and that's obviously a problem. But there's also a sense in which life and happiness, it's not intrinsic because it doesn't make sense apart from a valuer, apart from a human being, apart from a living organism. So I wouldn't say that it doesn't seem intrinsic to pursue life and happiness as an end in itself, because like there's a conscious being that's living, there's a conscious being that's achieving that happiness, and it's like both a metaphysical fact and sort of a fact of like consciousness as well, because like you're happy and you're maintaining your consciousness by living.
Yeah, so it's definitely not intrinsic in that sense.
Hmm.
Uh, so I wonder if there's another sense of intrinsic where it doesn't make sense to say it's intrinsic. I'm just going to quickly Google the term intrinsic and just get a
Sure.
common sense definition from the dictionary. So Google says intrinsic means belonging naturally or essential. Let's see what
That's a weird definition.
Merriam-Webster has. Belonging to the essential nature or constitution of a thing, the intrinsic worth of a gem, the intrinsic brightness of a star. Um, so maybe that first one, belonging to the essential nature or constitution of the thing. Is it true of life or happiness that belonging to their essential nature or constitution, they are worth pursuing? Um,
Mhm.
maybe we have to add for the person whose life or happiness it is.
Yeah. Hmm.
Uh, for that person, is it essential to the nature of that person's life
Well,
that
I
it is
think
worth
actually,
that it's
I
worth?
think when, yeah, I actually think when you add the like the that concept of like for the person, you're sort of making it not intrinsic, because think about the environment example once again. Like if you value the environment intrinsically, well now let's say you value the environment intrinsically for a person, well then it's not intrinsic anymore because it's valuable to that person for specific reasons. Although that might be a bad way of valuing a certain thing, like valuing it intrinsically for yourself. That's sort of contradictory in a sense.
Yeah, it's so with the environment. I mean, that's something distinct from if we're talking about like lakes and rivers and oceans.
Hmm.
And whereas here, the thing at issue is the person himself who he's potentially valuing. There's so it's kind of a I don't know a self-referential framework here.
Hmm.
The value is not the environment, but the one who is valuing. So,
Mm.
I mean, is the one who is valuing a value for himself, um, or is one's own life? Is it part of the essential nature of one's own life that it is valuable? Well, I mean, we can add here: is it valuable for oneself?
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know if I feel this is confusing when it gets self-referential like this. Like,
Hmm.
it's I'm not sure how to think of this. I don't want to get lost in words. Anyways,
Yeah. I I guess I don't know. I feel like there's a sense in which that does make sense though, because the whole idea of like life, like your life and your happiness being like almost intrinsically valuable to yourself, or sort of valuable to yourself as such. Because like if you achieve life, if you achieve a life of happiness, like that is good. That is good for you, like just in the nature of what that means, of what the terms mean of life and happiness. That is like sort of inherently good because you're happy, you're alive, you exist in a state of in a psychological state of happiness, which is a good state, sort of inherently in the definition of happiness.
and if the so here's another thought on this. If we take as the contrast to intrinsic as opposed to what, as opposed to extrinsic, I saw that because they have in this definition, extrinsic is given as a contrast. So if we think of so objectivism has this trichotomy of intrinsic, subjective, and objective.
Yeah.
But if instead of viewing it from that trichotomy perspective, we have a different kind of perspective on intrinsic, the intrinsic as opposed to the extrinsic, well, that's a different kind of relation.
Mm.
So maybe that's the sense from which it makes sense, or that's the reason I feel some attraction to this idea of calling life or happiness an intrinsic value, because I'm thinking implicitly that the foil, the contrast, is with extrinsic, as opposed to the
Yeah.
contrast being with subjective or objective. So the
Hmm.
idea of extrinsic is just something external. So life is not a value for something other than life, or
Yeah.
happiness is not a value for something
Ah,
other
yeah,
than
yeah.
happiness. If it were a value for something other than happiness, or if life were a value for something other than life, then it would be a value in virtue of an intrinsic consideration. But no, it's a value just on its own, not because of something else.
Hmm.
So maybe it's from that perspective on intrinsic that it makes sense to think of life or happiness as an intrinsic value. But maybe from if you're taking the trichotomy
Hmm.
perspective, then it would not be an intrinsic value, because
Yeah.
that's the one where it means like apart from any agent.
Hmm.
And as you were saying, it doesn't make sense for you to
Yeah.
value your life or happiness if you aren't in the picture.
Hmm.
So that's my that's my working understanding of this now. It's intrinsic
Yeah.
in some sense, but not in another.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense because honestly, with when you're thinking about the whole trichotomy perspective, it seems like the only word that it would fall into would be objective, because it's sort of valuable in and of itself for the person. Like I think it would fall under like an objective value in that. If you want to apply it to that trichotomy, it might not apply perfectly there, since it's like this is sort of an axiomatic concept of ethics, which makes it really difficult to talk about it in terms of like ethics and values, since it's sort of what underlies ethics.
Yeah. So the idea of objective is that you're factoring both consciousness and existence.
Hmm.
So for something to be an objective value means it's it's there's something in the world that you evaluate as
Mm-hmm.
being good for you. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just in your mind that something is good. There's some objective fact about reality that makes it
Mm-hmm.
good.
Mm-hmm.
But that fact has to be evaluated by your mind. It's not good in
Yep.
itself out in
Yeah.
the world. So there's a contribution of both consciousness and existence, and
Mm-hmm.
that those together make something an objective value.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, does that apply in the case of your own life as a whole or as such, that it's an objective value? I mean, um,
Mm-hmm.
I guess you could think of it like that as being objective value, because there is this thing in the world, or existentially, we might want to say, your life,
Yeah. Yep.
and you are evaluating your own life as a good thing, as something
Good
that
thing
you
for
want to
your life. Yeah. So it's
continue
like
pursuing.
self-referential.
Yeah, so it's not just in your mind that your life is good, and it's
Mm-hmm.
also not apart from your mind
Mm-hmm.
your life is good. It's both. Um, both your mind is involved and the world apart from your mind, including your physical body. So yeah, maybe it is right to say that your life is an objective value. So if we're taking the trichotomy perspective, it wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
be an intrinsic value, your own life, it would be an objective value. And if you're taking the non-trichotomy perspective, the intrinsic versus
Yeah.
extrinsic perspective, then maybe it is an intrinsic value in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess sort of thinking it from the trichotomy perspective, what would it mean if it were intrinsic from that perspective? It would mean like it's valuable apart from your life and apart from your happiness, which doesn't make sense because it quite literally is your life and your happiness. And if it were subjective, it would sort of be taking the sort of existential fact out of it that there's like that it's like something that you actually experience, and it's not just something that's like in your mind apart from reality. So like it seems like it has to be objective in that sense, as it's sort of like I'm struggling to formulate this because it's a tough self referential concept. um yeah, like what you were saying before, essentially I'm sort of drawing a blank here.
So, yeah, so I mean, the fact that happiness is involved, that brings in the psychological aspect of objectivity. Um,
Mm,
but I'm not sure that's what makes that's not what makes it objective, or that's not what fulfills the psychological aspect of objectivity as opposed to the existential aspect. I think it might be that your mind is evaluating your happiness or your life as a good thing, and that judgment, that value judgment by your mind, is what contributes the psychological aspect of objectivity, as opposed to the emotion of happiness itself being what makes it objective. Rather, it's the value judgments. My life is good, or my happiness is good. Um, if we're going to say that life or happiness is an objective value, um, what makes it objective is that you are judging it to be a value. And I guess there's some kind of existential reason for thinking it's a value. Um, so it was just the formulation of, I think you said something like, uh, happiness is what makes it objective, or part of what makes it objective. Um, but I'm not sure that's right, the right way to put it. I think it might be more the value judgment you have about happiness is partly
mm,
what makes it objective. We're getting into some fine-grained distinctions here, and it's easy to lose track of
mhm.
all this. I don't know if any of this is
Yeah.
coming across clearly.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I'm getting it for the most part. It's tough to like reformulate and restate. Um, but hmm, happiness. Wait, could you restate that quick?
So
Something about happiness.
when you say that something is an objective value,
Mhm.
You're saying there's something in the world that you're judging to be good.
Mhm.
So it's a little weird to say that about happiness, because is happiness something in the world?
Yeah.
Isn't it supposed to be like this internal or psychological state? If so, how could it be an objective value? Um, so uh, that's another wrinkle on all of this, which I didn't mention before,
Mm.
which
Well, I mean, concepts of consciousness, though, those are objective too, because you're sort of consciously identifying a sort of mental process that you're engaging. Is like it's and you're like sort of creating that concept with the due to like degrees of intensity or what specifically the emotion is. Um, and I get so there's a sense in which happiness still is an objective. I mean, happiness obviously still is an objective concept. And I think it would be an objective value here too, as you can sort of evaluate it, like evaluate that. You can sort of evaluate um, that emotion in your head as good. You can evaluate it as something that is a good feeling. Like you can't really get under that. You can't get under the feeling of happiness really as being good.
Yeah, so I think I was I was conflating like objective with mind independence. I mean, that is one sense of objective. Something is objective if
Mm-hmm.
it's independent of the mind. But I think that the relevant one here, when we're talking about like an objective value or an objective concept, is just it's an aspect of reality as evaluated or as apprehended by the mind. So if you just put it that way, well, yeah, consciousness is an aspect of reality. It's not independent of consciousness or independent of the mind, but it is an aspect of
Mm-hmm.
reality. So
Mm-hmm.
concepts of consciousness, including happiness, are aspects of reality as grasped by and as evaluated by the mind. So yeah, I think that erases the worry that I was having a minute ago about, well, happiness is something internal and psychological. So how can it be objective?
Mm-hmm.
It can be objective because it's still an aspect of reality. It's not objective in
Mm-hmm.
the sense of being mind independent, but that's not the relevant sense here when we're talking about objectivity in the way we are now by saying something is an objective value.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, so to say happiness is an objective value means it's an aspect of reality
Mm-hmm.
evaluated by us to be good.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think that's what it would mean to say happiness is an objective value, or that life
Mm-hmm.
is an objective value.
Mm-hmm.
Some part of reality or aspect of reality that we evaluate to be good. So,
Yeah.
um, as to how that exactly relates to what we were talking about earlier, I think you were saying happiness. I think you were saying happiness is an objective value, and I was
Mm-hmm.
challenging that by saying, oh, actually, it's the value judgment of happiness
Mm-hmm.
that's an objective value. But now that I'm thinking about it more, now I think it seems like it would be fine to say it as you did. Happiness is an objective value.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and now that seems right to me.
Yeah, for sure. Dope. And then yeah. Hmm. I'm trying to think of what the big picture of this conversation is and sort of tie this back into that general broader concept of like of I guess what we were talking about earlier, sort of this integration of life and happiness being this sort of like value in and of itself, and that's sort of what got this conversation going at sort of being that um sort of that we happiness is sort of this purpose of life and why we continue living. I don't know if that like it what's your opinion, I guess, on that formulation, that happiness kind of being the purpose of life, or the purpose of, yeah, that just basically that formulation, I guess, with.
Uh, well, I mean, I think there's a perspective from which that's true, and Rand does say that in a number of places. So I think not only is it true, but it's also Rand's view. So,
Mm-hmm.
but if that's understood in contrast to the view that life is also the purpose of life,
Mm-hmm.
that's where I think some trouble might
Yep.
come.
Yep, for sure, for sure. Because happiness is sort of inherent to like pursuing life, pursuing our values, and sort of pursuing life as an end in itself. That happiness is sort of a part of that. And it sort of seems like, it almost sort of seems like two different, as we were talking about earlier, two different perspectives on that same issue. Like thinking back to the living because of friends, family, etc., etc. It's sort of saying that, oh, I'm choosing to live because of my life, my values, obviously, like the things that are my life, that define my life, the friends, family, etc. um and and happiness would just be a different perspective on that, and saying like, psychologically, I pursue these things because they bring me happiness, and because of this reward of happiness. So there's a sense in which obviously we integrate the two, and that's what sort of what she means, I guess, when she says at one point that man's own life is his purpose, is his moral purpose, and on another hand says happiness is his moral purpose. They're two different perspectives on the same thing. It's sort of like, um, you pursue life as this sort of like existential thing. It's those values, and then happiness is the psychological perspective of like what those values bring you, what the reward those values give, the achievement of those values.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a plausible interpretation of her view, and it seems, just apart from that, a plausible view. Um, so I think it can make sense to say life is the purpose of life and happiness is the purpose of life, and just
Mm-hmm.
understand that those are two perspectives on the same thing, an existential
Mm-hmm.
perspective and a psychological perspective. And I guess the danger would only come where you think of like, uh, happiness is the purpose of life, as opposed to, like, instead of
Mm-hmm.
life being the purpose of life, or if you think of what happiness is the justification for life, as opposed to life being its own justification. um, that's where I'm concerned that
Yeah.
it might not be the right view,
Hmm.
because I think
I feel.
life, you could say, it is its own justification. It's an end in itself. We don't need anything else beyond it. But for certain purposes, you might want to highlight the psychological aspect of life,
Mm,
as being the
yeah.
purpose. Um,
Yeah. I think. Oh, yeah. I think. I guess one thing that, I'm trying to think how to formulate this. I guess one thing that I would want to add is that, I guess, or question you, I guess, ask about is, doesn't life only make sense as a justification if happiness is baked in? Like, if life does not bring happiness, if life is not defined like as a life qua man, a life of happiness, life isn't really an end in itself if you don't define it in that way.
yeah, I think if you abstract it out, the happiness part of life,
Mm-hmm.
then it wouldn't make sense to say life is an end in itself or its own justification. You would need something beyond life. Um,
Yeah.
that strikes me as plausible.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
But obviously, like, that's not the world that we live in. We live in a world where life does bring happiness. Happiness is the reward for life. That's sort of like kind of the definition of happiness. Happiness being just the reward for the non-contradictory joy that is the reward for achieving your life and your values that are consistent with life. So like we can't really say that, oh, like imagine this, we can't like sort of say when we're trying to define our ethics, imagine this other world where life and happiness are abstracted away from each other. Now we need happiness to justify life. Like that's not what we actually do. That's not actually the universe that we live in.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that thought experiment, and it might make
Mm-hmm.
sense to say that in that counterfactual world, that happiness is the justification of life, and life is not its own justification. Life needs some justification beyond itself. But if in the world we live in, where happiness is part of life, I think it makes sense to say both happiness is the purpose of life, and life is the purpose of life. You put it a minute ago as happiness is the reward of life. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but just remember, you could also say life is the reward of life. It's its own reward.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because it includes happiness.
Yep.
So as long as when you say happiness is the reward of life, you don't imply by that happiness is something distinct from life in the actual world.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think it's okay to say that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's okay to say anything, right? But I just mean, like,
Yeah.
I think it's Rand's view, at least, and I think it's plausible that it's true, that happiness is part of life as she conceives it. When she says man's life is the standard of value. So you can say happiness is the reward of life, but you can also say life is the reward of life. You get to have more of life, which includes happiness.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that makes sense. It seems like we've resolved this age-old question that has been perplexing the objectivist philosophers.
Well, maybe we've resolved part of it. I don't know if we've resolved all of it. Here's another.
Yeah, for sure.
Here's another aspect of it which I'm not sure about. So she says in somewhere that the choice to live is also the choice to think or to focus. I'm trying to find that passage. Oh no, that's not it. You know, the one where she says, like, existentially the choice to think or not to think is, I don't want to misquote it. Let's see. And she includes to be or not to be. Oh, here it is. Psychologically, the choice to think or not to think or not is the choice to focus or not. Existentially, the choice to focus or not is the choice to be conscious or not. Metaphysically, the choice to be conscious or not is the choice of life or death. That's paragraph 40 of the Objectivist Ethics. So she's equating the choice to think or not with the choice to focus or not, with the choice to be conscious or not, with the choice of life or not, life or death. And they're all the same choice from different perspectives: a psychological perspective, an existential perspective, and a metaphysical perspective. Now, in OPAR, Dr. Peikoff says that the choice to focus or not, for that choice, there is no why. Like, you can't ask, it doesn't make sense to ask, why did someone choose to focus rather than not? And that's part of what being a primary choice means, that there is no why. It's once you've made that choice, then you can consider reasons for doing such and such, but you can't consider reasons until you're already in focus. So there
Yeah.
can't be a reason to focus. So now,
But then hold up. This is something that I guess I have a few questions. Or sorry if I broke your train of thought.
well, let me just say one more thing.
Yeah, for sure.
So if there's no reason, no why for the choice to focus, and the choice to focus is the same choice as the choice to live or not, then there's no reason to choice to live or not, which is what we've been talking about for much of this call. What is the reason to live? What's the justification for choosing to live rather than not? Is it its own justification? Is it intrinsically a value? So how do we integrate these two ideas that there's no reason or justifier for the choice to focus, yet the choice to focus is the same choice from another perspective as the choice to live, yet there is a justification, at least according to some, like Darrell Wright, for the choice to live. He says there are these non-deliberative grounds to choose to live. And that makes it not an arbitrary choice. So do you see the tension that I'm trying to raise here?
Yeah.
Now, also in Opar, he says that I think he calls the person who doesn't choose to live a moral monster or something like that. On page 248, he says a primary choice does not mean an arbitrary, whimsical, or groundless choice. There are grounds for a certain primary choice, and those grounds are reality, all of it. The choice to live, as we have seen, is the choice to accept the realm of reality. This choice is not only not arbitrary, it is the precondition of criticizing the arbitrary. It is the base of reason. A man who would throw away his life without cause, who would reject the universe on principle, and embrace a zero for its own sake, such a man, according to objectivism, would belong on the lowest rung of hell. His action would indicate so profound a hatred of himself, of values, of reality, that he would have to be condemned by any human being as a monster. And I'll just finish the paragraph. The moment he would announce his decision seriously, he would be disqualified as an object of intellectual debate. One cannot argue with or about a walking corpse who has just consigned himself to the void of the non-conscious, the non-ethical, the non-anything. So there, he's saying that this person belongs on the lowest rung of hell, and he would have to be condemned as a monster. Well, this is kind of moral language, strong moral language.
Yeah.
But doesn't that imply that the choice to live itself, this primary choice, is not a pre-moral choice? It's already a choice that justifies moral condemnation or not. But I mean, it's said in Darrell Wright's essay and other places that the primary choice is a pre-moral choice. But if it's a pre-moral choice, how does it make sense to morally condemn someone who goes one way or the other on it? That's something I'm not clear on. And also, the idea that there are grounds for a certain primary choice. Well, if there are grounds for a primary choice to live, why aren't there also grounds for the primary choice to focus? Since it's the same choice from a different perspective. Yet he says in chapter 2, when he's talking about the primary choice to focus, that there is no why. But isn't that a way of saying that there are no grounds for it? A man just chooses? He says, it is invalid to ask, why did a man choose to focus? There is no such why. There is only the fact that a man chose. He chose the effort of consciousness, or he chose non-effort and unconsciousness. In this regard, every man at every waking moment is a prime mover. Okay, well, if there is no such a why for the choice to focus, and it's the same choice as the choice to live, then there's no why for the choice to live. There's only the fact that a man chose to live.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's not clear to
I mean,
me how the condemnation comes in.
is it the same to say that there's no grounds for that, for the choice to focus, and to say that there's no reason for the choice to focus, and to say that there's no motivation to the choice to focus? Because it seems like in saying that there's no reason for the choice to focus, you're almost it's the like attempt to sort of avoid determinism, to avoid like this sort of idea that there is some external reason or some reason that a man chose to focus that's like almost apart from him. But it's like the choice to focus is sort of this like self-generated thing. It's almost for the sake of focusing that you choose to focus. I don't know. That's an issue I struggle with, because I don't know if I fully grasp the implications of Peikoff's saying that you don't have there's no grounds for that choice, or what was the specific quote?
There is no, it's on page 60. He says, it's invalid to ask, why did a man choose to focus? There is no such why. There is only the fact that a man chose. He chose the effort of consciousness, or he chose non-effort and unconsciousness. In this regard, every man at every waking moment is a prime mover. So he doesn't use the term grounds or reason or motivation, but I think that's basically what it comes down to. You could use those terms. Like he could have, instead of saying there is no such why, he could have said there is no reason or motivation or grounds. There's only the fact that a man chose. I take it those are all just different ways of saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's not clear to me how there's not grounds for that choice, yet there is grounds for the choice to live, given that those are supposed to be the same choice from different perspectives. So that's one thing I'm not clear about. There's also like there's going from a state of unfocus to a state of focus, and then there's already being in a state of focus and choosing to maintain focus. Well, if that's the kind of choice to focus we're talking about, then I guess there could be some kind of grounds. If you're already in focus and you have to just maintain that focus, well, then you could consider reasons to maintain and focus. And maybe there's some parallel to the choice to live. If you're already choosing to live, then maybe in that framework or from that context, you could consider reasons to continue living. But I guess you can never be in a state of not living and then choosing to live. You're already living. You have to already be living to make the choice whether to live or not. Yeah. So that's an interesting difference between the choice to focus or not, which I haven't really considered before, is that you can sometimes make the choice to focus or not from a state of unfocus. I guess if you're just waking up and you're very groggy or something, but you can never make the choice to live or not from a state of not living, unless we're including in not living like a subhuman way of living. And maybe that is how we should be thinking of it, because when she talks about the choice to live, she means live qua man. That's the choice we phrase. Should we be choices rational being or suicidal animal? It's not zero or life. And it's also, so maybe the parallel is still there between the choice to focus or not from a state of unfocus, which we might say is like a subhuman state. of consciousness, and then the choice to live or not can be made from a state of not fully living, not being present rationally. We haven't chosen to activate our minds yet. So yeah, I guess they are still
Yeah, I mean,
parallel, but that still
like,
leaves me
I
with
don't know.
this puzzle
If
about why there's no such why. There's no why for the choice to focus, but there is in some sense a why for the choice to live, at least in some passages. I don't know if Peikoff
yeah,
would always say that.
yeah, huh. I mean, it feels like with the choice to focus, like I can, like, let's say I'm just like reading a book, and then all of a sudden, like, I realize I'm drifting, and then I'm like, oh, let me focus again. Like there's a sense in which you kind of can choose to focus for a reason. I mean, you definitely choose to focus. It feels weird to say there's no why to that. I'm trying to think of what that like explicitly means. So that because I guess right now I'm sort of struggling to expand on that because I'm not fully sure what the implications of like saying there's no why to your choice to focus or not to focus means.
Yeah, well, think about, I mean, doesn't it seem kind of incoherent to say there could be a why? Because if there were a why, some reason you were
Mhm.
considering, you would already be in focus.
Yeah.
You would have to
Oh,
be in
yeah, for sure,
focus
for sure.
to consider that reason.
So
So,
yeah, so sort of, I guess then there's a reason to like maintain focus then, like as you were saying, like you can say like, oh, I'm already in focus. I'm already focusing on like trying to read this thing, and then I see that I'm drifting, and like I'm sort of focused on that, and I'm like, no, maintain focus on what I'm doing right now. Um, and I guess it would be a similar thing with life. Like if you notice like in life you're starting to like drift or starting to not like live as a human being and focus on your values, then you can sort of say, no, I need to focus on these values and choose to live once again.
maybe, um, yeah. So maybe if if you're already in focus, you can see reasons for continuing to choose to focus. It's only when you haven't yet chosen to focus that there would be no why. And when you haven't yet chosen to live in a human sense, qua rational being, um, which I guess involves having a focused mind. So when you haven't yet made that choice, that there wouldn't be a why,
Mm,
um, because until you're in focus, until you're living in that sense, you can't
yeah.
entertain further reasons to
Hmm.
live. But then would you really need reasons to live or to focus? Then if if you've already made the choice to focus or to live, then uh,
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's sort of like a continual process though. Like you have to continually focus and you have to continually live. So you have to sort of decide, oh, am I going to continue to focus here? Am I going to continue to pursue my life? And then you can ask that question and realize, like, in the case of life, like I have these values and they bring me happiness. And now for that reason, I'm going to continue living as a human being and pursuing my happiness.
yeah. So then, I mean, how does that help resolve this puzzle that I was posing before? Is it right to say that there is no such why? Is it only right some of the time to say there is no such why, but not others when we're talking about the primary
Maybe
choice?
it's maybe it's like in that just initial choice to live or initial choice to focus. Like you don't really like when you decide to start pursuing values, there's not really like or when you decide to live or decide to focus, there's not really a why. You just sort of make that. That's weird to say, huh? This is not something I've given much thought to. This is interesting. I'm glad we're going into this, because this is something that I think I need to think about more.
One thing I wonder about is the distribution of these choices. Like, how often is it that we're making the choice to get into focus from a state of unfocus, as opposed to maintain focus once we're already in focus? So there's two ways we could be choosing to focus. We could be choosing that state from a state of unfocus, or we could be choosing that state from a state of focus. And it would just be, in the latter case, choosing to continue to focus. So, like, in the morning when I wake up, is that when I make a choice to focus from a state of unfocus, and then the rest of the day is all my choices to focus are just choices to maintain focus? So in that case, I would be making a lot more choices of the maintain focus variety than of the get into focus from a non-focus kind of variety of choice to focus. But I think we know that we can go out of focus during the day too. As you were saying, sometimes you're reading a book, find that your mind is just wandering. And so I don't think it's right that we just choose like once in the morning to get into focus from a state of unfocus, and then all our remaining choices during the day are to focus, are choices to maintain focus. I think there are times throughout the day, I mean, it could vary from day to day, depending on what you're doing. It could vary as to how many times you are choosing to maintain focus versus get into focus from a state of non-focus. I imagine that varies a lot among people, and then for a given person, depending on what that person is doing. So yeah, I think there's quite a bit of variability there, and then we can map all this onto the choice to live, and then likewise say there's a lot of variability in the kinds of choices to live people make. Some of them being choices to live from a state of not having made the choice to live, I guess, being on a subhuman level and just letting one's mind wander. And then there are other choices to live, which are choices to continue having one's mind be fully engaged, fully alert in pursuing values, aware of all the relevant considerations, holding context, doing all the things mentally we need to in order to maximally succeed in pursuing values. So yeah, I mean, I'm still not sure what to make of this statement. Maybe it's only in a subset of, maybe the statement is just too generalized. Like, maybe it would be more accurate to say sometimes there's a why, but then I still worry that that's incoherent. No, because it is incoherent if you're assuming it's the kind of choice to focus where you're coming in from a state of unfocus. But it's not incoherent to think you could have a why for a choice to focus if you're just choosing to maintain focus. So maybe there's an implicit assumption of the kind of choice to focus he's talking about here.
That is just like the initial choice to focus, the primary choice to focus.
Yeah. And we might want to distinguish between primary choices to focus and secondary primary choices to focus, where the primary choice is where you're choosing to focus from a state of unfocus. In a secondary primary choice to focus would be the case where you're choosing to focus from a state where you're already in focus. So you've already
Mm.
made the choice to focus, but then your further choice to focus is just the choice to maintain focus, not to get into focus in the
Yeah.
first place. So maybe if we
Mm.
draw that distinction, that would help make sense of this passage. And maybe what he means is there's no such why for a primary choice.
Yeah.
I thought maybe it's worth adding that I think Harry Binswanger in an article, I believe it's Volition as Cognitive Self-Regulation, he says there's a kind of motivation for the primary choice. He says there's a metaphysical motive,
Hmm.
um, as opposed to some specific thing in reality that's motivating someone to focus. It's just reality as such. I think that's what he means by saying there's a
Yeah.
metaphysical motive.
That actually reminds me of the Greg Salamiria quote that Puya talked about, or in our conversation, where it was like, it kind of draws that parallel to that choice to live, because when you make that choice to live, you're sort of choosing based on the fact of like everything. You're choosing to live. You're choosing to exist in reality, and that sort of ties that parallel to like choosing your values and choosing those things. That's sort of what you're choosing when you live, and it's that same thing when you choose to focus. You're choosing to focus like on metaphysics, sort of, or the whatever the thing that Binswanger said, metaphysically, like focus on reality and focus for the sake of reality, of being in focus, essentially.
Yeah. So he called it a metaphysical motive, and it's just there's a motive to, I guess the idea is motivation is to be aware of the world as a whole, not some particular thing within the world, but just to be aware of anything you need to be aware of. Be open to perceiving everything. And that would seem to ally with, or align with where Dr. Peikoff talks about the primary choice to live. And he says there are grounds for a certain
Mm-hmm.
primary choice, and those grounds are reality, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
The choice to live, as we have seen, is the choice to accept the realm of reality. Well, that's kind of what you're doing when you're focusing your mind. You're accepting the realm of reality. You're getting your mind in gear to be alert to anything you might need to deal with. So it's kind of a metaphysical focus, you might want to say. Um, okay, but then if there are these grounds to focus, or if there are these grounds to choose to live, those grounds being reality, all of it,
Mm-hmm.
then couldn't we just say the same thing about the primary choice? There is a why as to why did a man chose to focus, namely reality, all of it. Can't we say that?
Hmm.
So, yeah, I guess
Yeah.
I
I'm
still
so,
don't have.
I my I think I I don't know if we're necessarily applying that Peikoff quote correctly. I'm trying to think of what actual context he meant that quote, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure that this specific like sort of focus, looking at look. I'm trying to think of what he would specifically mean by saying there's no why, because there's hmm, because it seems like there's a sense that there's no sort of why in a lot of these primary choices, but there still is sort of a grounds for making those choices. It's not like a completely arbitrary choice. It's
Maybe this is where. Well, I don't know if this is where Darrell Wright's distinction between a deliberative grounds and a non-deliberative grounds would be helpful. Like maybe
yeah.
there is a grounds in a non-deliberative sense or non-propositional content sense, but there's not a grounds in a propositional content sense. Um, I mean, as to the let me just read one paragraph before the one where he says there is no why. So right before that, he says there can be no motive or value judgment which precedes consciousness, in which induces a man to become conscious. The decision to perceive reality must precede value judgments. Otherwise, values have no source in one's cognition of reality. and thus become delusions. Values do not lead to consciousness. Consciousness is what leads to values. Then he goes on to say, in short, it is invalid to ask, why did a man choose to focus? There is no such why. So he's elaborating in that prior paragraph about this idea that there is no why. Just to restate or reword, it's consciousness precedes value judgments. Value judgments don't precede consciousness. You first have to be conscious to consider, this would be good for me or this would not be good for me. So it's like you have to make the choice to be conscious without the guidance of any values.
Yeah.
But then, you might worry that's arbitrary. But I think he deals in a satisfactory way. At least it seems plausible to me that he handles the arbitrary worry issue. He handles the worry that there's arbitrariness well when he says, the choice to live, as we have seen, is the choice to accept the realm of reality. This choice is not only not arbitrary, it's the precondition of criticizing the arbitrary. It's the basis of reason. So it doesn't really make sense to say a primary choice is arbitrary if the primary choice is accepting reality, because what gives rise to the claim, or what gives rise to this idea of something being arbitrary, is that you're already in the realm of reality. And once you're in that realm and you say something is arbitrary, then what that means is saying it's not based on reality or something like that. So if you haven't yet entered the realm of reality by getting your mind into focus or by choosing to live, then there's no sense to saying that some choice is arbitrary. It's only after you've chosen to accept reality that then you can say other choices you make are arbitrary.
Mm-hmm. But then, is it good to accept the realm of reality, though? I mean, that's sort of the initial question that pops into my head with this.
Well, conditionally good if you want to live.
Yeah.
But is it unconditionally? That I don't know that it makes sense to say that it's unconditionally good to accept reality, because the whole notion of good presupposes you've already accepted reality. Like, things can be good if they're good by reference to the fact that of your life. They're good because they help maintain your life. But if you haven't yet chosen life, if you haven't yet accepted life, then how can something be good? I mean, I think that's what
I don't know. It seems like we can sort of like realize that life is good just by looking at reality, but we have to like be alive to look at reality and see that life is good. So it's sort of, it becomes a difficult issue here.
Yeah, and you have to be in focus to see that life is good.
Yes, so it's almost like I'm sort of looking at it as a decision of, should I maintain life? Should I continue living? When this is sort of talking about like, should you accept reality at all? And there's no real reason why you end up like coming into focus initially. You simply snap into focus, or that seems weird because it makes it sound like random or deterministic.
Well, I don't know why it would be that. I mean, it's so why not just say it's volitional? It's neither random nor deterministic. It's volitional, but it's not motivated, and it's not arbitrary, because the concept of arbitrary doesn't apply yet until you've made the choice. So the the sting of arbitrariness, you know, the sting is taken out when we're talking about the primary choice, because the sting only comes once you've already accepted reality as your realm. Then you can criticize someone for saying, well, this is just arbitrary. It's based on nothing. It's not based on anything in reality. Okay. Well, if you haven't gotten yourself into reality yet, then what's the problem?
Yeah, I think I have a lot of thinking to do on this, because this is I think this is an issue that I have to work out a lot more. Like this whole issue of how can we sort of choose reality? Like, do we choose reality? Yeah, it seems like we do. Like we have to choose to focus, but it seems weird to think of a choice as sort of unmotivated.
I mean, certainly it's weird to think of some choices as unmotivated. But I mean, you know, I choose to eat food because I want to satisfy my hunger, and you choose to go to school because you want to get a degree and advance your life and your career. So yeah, all kinds of choices are motivated, but is it right to say that, you know, could there be some subset, namely the primary choice, that is not motivated, or that maybe is motivated in an unusual kind of way? Like, should we say it has a metaphysical motive, to use this term Harry uses, Harry Binswanger?
Yeah.
I mean, I think if it is right to say that all choices have a motive, I think we at least need to say that they don't all have a motive in the same kind of way. So
Yeah.
some have like a specific kind of motive, and some are more generic or metaphysical. Maybe Dr. Peikoff would agree with that, and maybe there's a different way of phrasing it. Like maybe instead of talking in terms of metaphysical motives and specific motives, he just talks in terms of there being no motives and then ordinary motives. And since the motive involved in the primary choice is not the ordinary kind of motive, like the motive to eat food or to go to school, he just says there's no motive.
Yeah. So it's like he's saying there's no motive, but there is like a different kind of motive that he doesn't define in this context as motive. It's like the metaphysical motive, the motive to focus on reality. It's sort of like it feels like almost like a self-referential motive. Like the reason that you focus is sort of to focus on reality almost, or to exist in reality, to exist in the realm of reality.
I mean, maybe that would align his view with Harry Binswanger's, but I kind of doubt it, because I mean, I'm quoting him. He says there can be no motive or value judgment which precedes consciousness and which induces a man to become conscious. I mean, that's pretty explicit. There is no motive, or there can be no motive. Not only there isn't one, but it's impossible for there to be one. I mean, maybe we can try to read into that and say what he really means by that is there's no ordinary sort of motive, but there's a non-deliberative motive, a la Darrell writes, or there's a metaphysical motive, a la Harry Binswanger. There's just no motive in the ordinary sense, but I'm not very confident that he would want to sign on to that, given what he says in this paragraph. Values do not lead to consciousness. Consciousness is what leads to values. I mean, some of this language seems pretty strongly against the idea that there's any motive at all. So I would be hesitant to attribute that view to him. and Rand doesn't really, as for her view on all this, I mean, I don't know that she discusses this issue in this kind of detail.
Yeah.
I mean, she had some seminal thoughts on the choice to live and
Oh, you're
choice
cutting
to
out a little bit.
focus. But
You cut out a little bit for that last statement.
I was saying, as for Rand's view, I don't know that I don't know what she would say about all this. Like, would she talk more in the Peikoff way, or more in the Binswanger or Darrell Wright way? I mean, Peikoff was her intellectual heir in some sense, and he wrote the book, so maybe that puts some more weight on his interpretation, at least when it comes to figure out, what she would have thought on this. And it is a separate question of, what's actually true. So I guess,
is there a sense in which we can integrate those two perspectives, or are they like categorically different, I guess? Or
I mean, I was kind of trying to I was making an attempt a couple minutes ago to try to integrate them, but I'm not very confident that Peikoff's perspective in the end is consistent with Binswanger's or Wright's. And I don't even know what Ayn Rand's perspective is, because she doesn't seem to get into the nitty-gritty details of the sort that Peikoff.
But he seems to say later that with the whole life perspective, that it's like motivated by reality itself. Like it's not an arbitrary choice. So it seems like there's a sense in which he doesn't fully hold to that view that there's no choice, like there's no motivation whatsoever. It seems like that sort of distinction between like an ordinary motivation and like a metaphysical motivation might be something that Peikoff holds, although that he didn't explicitly state it in Opar.
Well, yeah. So maybe there's an internal inconsistency in Opar between page 60 and page 248.
Maybe it's not an inconsistency though. Maybe it's like just a different sort of focus on certain things. Like what is Peikoff's intent with saying that there's no motivation for choosing to focus? Like what is his what does that sort of mean in reality? What is the intention of saying, of like emphasizing that point?
What is the yes? So what's his motivation for saying there's no motivation?
Yeah. Because for me, it sounds like it's more like just trying to say like there's nothing, like it's just like a primary choice. Like there's no explanatory factor apart from the choice itself. Like it seems like it's almost avoiding determinism in that sense. It's trying to say like there's no like reason in reality that forces you to make this choice versus a different choice. That's sort of how I interpret that, or the intent behind it. It's that statement.
Well, I mean, I think he's trying to flesh out the nature of the primary choice in chapter 2, and so I mean, I think that's his motivation for discussing this issue of motivation as it relates to the primary choice. He's just trying to lay out clearly what is the nature of this thing, and part of the nature of it is that there is no motivation. There's no why. I guess because, I mean, this is something that people will often raise as an objection or a confusion or a criticism, like all choices have to have reasons. So what's the reason for the primary choice? And maybe he wants to, partly his reason for going into this is to address that kind of question. Say, look, you're not understanding the nature of a primary choice, which is that it's not like other choices. It doesn't have reasons or motives. But then, as you pointed out, and as I think I came up earlier, he does say, in connection with the choice to live, that there are grounds for it.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that consistent with the idea that there's no motivation for the choice to focus, given that they're the same choice from different perspectives?
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe there is a tension between these two passages in Opar, and I don't know if there's a way to resolve that.
I
I'm
mean,
not sure.
it seems like we were on to something with that sort of distinction between like an ordinary choice and a metaphysical choice. That could be a potential way to resolve it, since like there's no, like you could look at there's no why as sort of saying there's no like explicit reason for it, but you still have this implicit reason of reality.
Maybe, but I'm not sure that's consistent with what he says here when he says there can be no motivation or value judgments which induces someone to become conscious. Because wouldn't this metaphysical motivation be something that induces someone to become conscious? Values do not lead to consciousness. Consciousness is what leads to values. So, I mean, the value of being in touch with reality, I mean, if that's what's motivating someone, well, they'd already have to be conscious to consider that motive.
Well, maybe it's not an explicit motive though. It could be sort of implicit in that choice to focus.
A non-deliberative motive, to use
Yeah.
the right term. Maybe. I mean, he doesn't draw a distinction between explicit and implicit motives. He just says there can be no motive.
Mm-hmm.
So does he really mean there can be no explicit motive? Maybe, but I'm not very confident about that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to bet my life on it.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Values have no source in one's cognition of reality. Does he really mean values have no source in one's explicit cognition of reality, but they could have a source in one's implicit cognition of reality? Maybe,
It's
but
possible. Yeah, it's
explicit values do not lead to consciousness, but maybe implicit values could lead to consciousness.
yeah, possibly.
Possibly.
Hmm.
I mean, what about an animal? An animal doesn't have explicit values in the sense of propositionally formulated value judgments. Um,
Animals can't really make those choices though. They can't really choose to focus, so to speak.
well, yeah, yeah. So this is
Hmm.
not even applicable to them plausibly.
Yeah.
I was just trying to think of like what would be something at least that has implicit values or non-deliberative values. I guess you could think of it like an animal or a baby, maybe.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think this is just a question mark right now for me.
Yeah. No, for sure. I think it's interesting to dive into, but I didn't. I have a feeling we're not going to resolve this issue, as it's something that has been debated by objectivist intellectuals for a long time. But I think we've made a little bit of progress in at least identifying what the issue is to sort of think about in the future. And for viewers, if you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments below to resolve this issue.
Please do.
Yeah, for sure. Um, but yeah, I think Yeah, there's I mean, there's a sense in which it's not motivated though, the choice to focus. Like you simply just do focus. Because if you're going to decide to like focus on a thing, you have to first decide to focus. Like you have to first decide to focus on the fact that you want to focus. So I don't know. Focus is a difficult issue for me that I have to do a lot more thinking and reading in to
Mhm.
fully grasp. And yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Volition was actually one of the issues I first wrestled with in philosophy and many years ago in
Mm-hmm.
high school. Um, I was obsessed with free will and how to make sense of it. Uh, and and I wrote a master's thesis on free will many years after that. And I've gotten away from it a bit recently in working on selfishness, but
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very interesting and important issue, a very foundational issue. Um, and I guess it's very important to objectivism and the culture. I mean, Sam Harris is coming to mind as this prominent
Oh yeah.
exponent of determinism. So he's out there, promoting his ideas. And I guess if we want to promote objectivism, and part of doing that is getting clear on free will and having coherent, consistent answers,
Mm-hmm.
alternatives to the determinists or indeterminists. Um, so, I mean, it's not that the only reason to be interested in this is polemical in
Mm-hmm.
fighting against other people, but that's
Oh
one
yeah.
reason, one motivation, a specific non-metaphysical motivation one might be interested in this
Mm-hmm.
is to be able to present objectivism in a coherent way um, to the world.
Yeah, and sort of resolving this free will determinism debate would have so many implications, especially in the field of psychology, where it's like they haven't even accepted the fact that we have free will yet, and that leads to all sorts of just crazy theories, like the whole Pavlovian thing, which basically treats us like non-volitional animals who like, oh, we're gonna salivate after we hear this bell enough times. It's like, yeah, it's just a complete denial of free will and ideas and all those sort of things. So I think winning the free will debate would be instrumental in changing um in changing the scientific landscape, the psychological landscape, and eventually like making objectivism prominent in the culture.
Yeah, and it's quite a blow to man's self-esteem too, to think that you're just this puppet,
Mm-hmm.
or you don't have control over your own mind. And I guess that's, that could pave the way to authoritarianism and dictatorship. If people see themselves as these puppets, basically, who don't have control of their own lives, um, and they have a low self-esteem because they have this metaphysical view of their own
Mm-hmm.
nature, then maybe that reduces the resistance to tyranny. I mean, can you really have self-esteem to stand up for yourself uh, if you see yourself as just this deterministic machine? Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think people with self-esteem and pride and confidence, I mean, a belief in free will helps that out a lot.
Oh yeah, for sure. Because then if you like achieve something, you know that it's based on something that this could have been different. Like I could have made the wrong choices and not achieved this thing. Like I had to make these specific choices to pursue these specific values in this specific way to achieve these great values. And to think that it's just, oh, this was going to happen anyways, it's such a blow to your self-esteem. It just, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I built that, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to Obama's "you didn't build that."
Oh yep, yep.
Yeah, if it wasn't, if your achievements weren't really your achievements because they're just a product of environmental factors or genetic factors, it wasn't really your free will that's um, to be credited, then, who are you to resist when the government wants to seize your achievements?
Yeah.
um, it wasn't really you. So what grounds do you have to put up a fight, stand up for your
Yeah,
own
for sure.
rights?
For sure, for sure. And yeah, I guess one thing I noticed people just like I thought people had like this sort of passion for freedom. I thought this was like something very common until this whole Corona thing happened. And after arguing with people and seeing how people have responded to this, it's just like these, like, most people do not want their rights to be maintained. They want somebody to come in and protect them and to sort of be their protector, I guess, sort of tell them what to do, tell them how to live their lives, tell them, and just keep them safe, like a sort of big brother government that sort of just controls you, tells you what to do, tells you how to stay safe, it keeps you safe, make sure that nothing bad happens to you, and in the process doesn't actually let you go and achieve your happiness and achieve what you want to do with your life.
Yeah, I've wondered about this, like what the American reaction to the whole lockdown
Mm.
uh, orders says about the American spirits. I mean, on the one hand, you might think, well, they're trying to be reasonable about it and go by the scientific evidence. But then, there's got to be a certain limit to that. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if you're totally destroying people's lives for the sake of some small subset of people,
Mm-hmm.
then you're basically asking some people to sacrifice for others.
Yep.
It's no longer a rational public policy decision.
Mm-hmm.
It's sacrificing people's lives, and it, so I think just because people are willing to put up with some lockdown doesn't necessarily imply that they're ready to just roll over and take anything.
Mm-hmm.
But as it goes on and on and on, it's more likely that if people continue to put up with it, that it is a sign of lack of self-esteem, and they're not asserting their own right to their own lives. They're willing to allow themselves to be sacrificed for other people, for the greater good.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, maybe we're getting to that point now.
Yeah. I mean, what really scares me is the people who will just say like, oh, well, we have to do this at all costs. We have to prevent the spread of Corona at all costs, prevent more deaths, no matter what the cost is. And then people who will just say, oh, you're concerned about the economy going down. You're concerned about a few stock numbers going down. They like mock people who are like, oh, the Dow Jones is down by 1%. They'll just mock the people who care about the economy. But really what they're doing is they're replacing one crisis with another. They're replacing the coronavirus crisis with like an economic crisis, which is like Corona it's going to lead to a lot of deaths. It's going to lead to a lot of suffering. The economy is not this like minor thing that we can just completely overlook and disregard for the sake of preventing deaths by Corona.
Yeah. So as the saying goes, maybe the cure is worse than the disease.
Mm-hmm.
The cure being the lockdowns. Yeah, maybe the harm done by the lockdowns could actually result in more deaths in the long run. But it's hard to prove that or calculate that, because they could be indirect. Like one thing I always think is just people's health. Like the poorer you are, the less you can afford to eat healthily, because maybe healthy food costs more than just cheap dollar menu at McDonald's or wherever.
Yeah.
But if the economy crashes and you have massive poverty, and as a result, you have suicides at an increased
Mm-hmm.
rate, but also just people can't eat as healthily. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that could lead to diseases that could increase chances of cancer,
Mm-hmm.
which could, reduce people's lives by years or decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So I
and
mean, that's a serious loss of life and shortening of life.
mhm.
But you can't trace that. You can't just say, oh, there's this
Mhm.
lockdown for X number of
Yep.
months, and that led to this guy getting cancer 10 years down the line.
Yeah, that doesn't get the headlines. Like the headline's always going to be coronavirus kills 1 million people rather than 3 million people die in a decade due to the fact that they became poor and can't that's not what draws people's attention. People are drawn to sort of direct consequences of things. It's sort of that distinction between like the seen and the unseen in economics, where like you can like see that, oh, the government built this project, but you don't see like all the things that didn't get built by the fact that the government took that money and redirected it to other things. It's the same sort of principle here, because you're like, oh, you see all these deaths, but then you don't see what happens to, or you see all these deaths that, or the deaths that, and how they got reduced potentially, but you don't see like how these other deaths over here got increased as directly.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I was thinking the same thing. The broken window fallacy, to use
Mm-hmm.
the term from Henry Hazlitt's book. I don't know if he uses that phrase, but that's his example. The
Mm-hmm.
hoodlum breaks the window with throws a
Yep.
rock through it, and then look at all the business it created. The guy has to buy a new window, so he finances the glass maker, and then now the glass maker has more money and he can
Mm-hmm.
buy something else. So, isn't the way to create wealth just destroy things? Yeah, but what about all the things that you could have used that money for instead of just getting them back to
Mm-hmm.
the status quo that are now not being made? Uh,
Yep.
you don't see that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, in that case of the broken window fallacy, like he would have preferred to spend his money on something that is more valuable to him than a new window. Like he and then this sort of, it sort of misallocates the economy towards the glass makers rather than the people that he actually wants to buy from, and it just leads to all these economic problems. And it's it's so complex for some people. Some people don't notice it because it's like it's conceptual. It's not something that you see directly. Like you have to form the concept of, oh, this person has values, and he, if what would he do if he didn't spend his money on this? And you have to like think conceptually about all these things and think abstractly. But I mean, this is not like what we're taught to do for most of our lives. We're taught just think think perceptually, put everything in its little category, and don't integrate things. Just yeah, just memorize and repeat. I guess that's kind of how we're taught in schools.
Yeah, so it's basically staying on the perceptual level,
Mm-hmm.
um, as opposed to rising to the conceptual level, the distinctively human level, and
Mm-hmm.
applying your powers as a rational animal. Um, yeah, that's when you put it as the distinction between the seen and the unseen. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
really important. It's kind of like the distinction between the perceptual and the conceptual.
Mm-hmm.
But the conceptual is the distinctively human realm. It allows us
Mm-hmm.
to integrate not just what we see immediately in front of us, but that with all the long range consequences of
Mm-hmm.
what we see in front of us. And our lives are lived long range. We don't just live in a
Mm-hmm.
snapshot at one moment. Our lives are continuous through time, but the only way to be aware of that continuity is by choosing to focus and choosing to
Yep.
think, choosing to live, going back
Yep.
to our discussion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, yeah, that's ultimately like how we live. That's how we live, by being conceptual. Like that's what makes humans better than the animals. That's what makes the animals sort of inferior in that sense. That's why we have iPhones and skyscrapers and computers and all these different things. Like because we are conceptual, we think long range and figure these things out. Unlike the animals.
Yeah, we're not still cavemen, doing the same thing generation after generation. We can make
Mm-hmm.
progress, which
Yep.
that's which the other animals can't. They're just stuck on the perceptual level. Um,
Mm-hmm.
no fault to them because that's all they can do. But
Yeah.
yeah, we can do better, and we should do better. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I guess sort of an unrelated topic. I know you went through the Objectivist Academic Center, and I've been considering that, but I don't know if that's like sort of worth the money, or sort of like worth, if I would be able to get much, as much out of that as I would like to it, or if I should like sort of, I guess, what was your experience with that?
Well, so I was in it for 4 years in their undergraduate program. It's a 3-year
Mm-hmm.
program now for the undergraduates.
Mm-hmm.
But back when I was in it, it was a 4-year program. Uh, and they also had graduate program after that, but that's also morphed over the years. And I went through some years of the graduate program too. But so if you're considering the undergraduate program, I guess my experience was different than many people's in that I had already heard basically all of the courses by Leonard Peikoff before I
Mm-hmm.
ever started the OAC. So I don't think I got as much out of it as a lot of students, because some of the courses were entirely based on Leonard Peikoff's courses, which I think are excellent courses,
Yep.
like his Understanding Objectivism, which actually is a book now. Hadn't yet been turned into a book when I had gone through, but I had heard the course. His course, Objectivism Through Induction, The Art of Thinking, Judging,
Mm-hmm.
Feeling, and Not Being Moralistic, Objective Communication, History of Philosophy. All of those
Yeah.
were part of the curriculum, although there ended up not being a test for the history of philosophy. But it was part of the original idea for the program. And I had heard of all of those, I think some of them multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that stuff was groundbreaking for me when I first heard it. But when I was going through the OAC, it was more just like, okay, this is a refresher. Whereas for most students, I think it was their first time hearing that stuff, because all that stuff is free online now.
Yep.
Um, and anybody can hear it. But it was not like that when I was going through. You had to pay
Mm-hmm.
hundreds and hundreds of dollars for these
Yeah.
courses. And I did that because I really wanted to hear them, as soon as I could. Um, so when I was going through college, undergraduate, I heard all the courses. Um, and then when I got to the OAC, it was like, okay, well, this is mostly a refresher.
Mm.
Now, not all the courses were like that. Some were like, there was an introduction to philosophy course. But I already got a bachelor's degree in philosophy by that time.
Oh, yeah.
So I was actually exempt from that course. And there was also an intro to logic course, but I had already taken intro logic
Mm.
in undergraduate philosophy. So I didn't have to take that, or at least not most of it. There was a section on induction, which I did take. And I think most of the students who are going through the OAC undergraduate program, they're simultaneously undergraduates in college. So
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of in an unusual situation. I had already gotten a lot of the contents of the OAC before I entered the OAC.
Mm.
So it wasn't as like groundbreaking or like life altering as I think it was for many other students. And, I don't know if that's more the case these days, where a lot of these courses you can get online for free. They're not, you don't have to
Mm-hmm.
pay hundreds of dollars for them. So a lot of the value you can get very easily. But there is an instructor element, which is absent from just when you're studying things on your own. So when you go through the OAC, you do get feedback from the instructors. At the time, it was only OnCar and one or two others who are no longer involved with the OAC. But now there's I think they have several instructors: OnCar, Ben Bayer, Aaron Smith. I don't know if Ilan Jorno is still teaching, or Keith Lockitch. And
Mm.
you'll get individualized feedback from them on assignments, and that's valuable. Because it's one thing to just listen to a lecture course. It's another thing to put your knowledge to the test and actually have to make your thinking objective in the mind independent sense. of putting your thoughts on paper, having to express yourself clearly and persuasively, and then someone can evaluate that. I
Hmm.
mean, that's taking it to another level um, than just absorbing stuff by listening to it. Um, so I think that is valuable, and I did get value
Hmm.
out of that as I was going through the OAC. The instructor feedback. There were some tutorials, one-on-one tutorials. I had a couple of those with OnCar. I don't know if they're still doing that. They're extremely busy, um, but in any case, that is one advantage of going through the OAC, is that you get this instructor feedback,
Hmm.
individualized feedback on your work, which you wouldn't otherwise get. Um, Another thing to consider is auditing. So they have an audit option now, which you might want to consider if you're just not sure if
Hmm.
you want to sign up as a full-time student, or you just don't have time to be a full-time student, um, given what else other values you have to pursue. You can do auditing, which is paid. You have to pay for it. Um, if you're a student, I think you can apply for scholarships
Yeah.
to have the
What is the
tuition.
auditing? What is auditing?
It's basically like a student minus the grading. So you can sit in
Oh.
on the classes. And I think they might even allow you to participate in classes, like online classes.
Hmm.
Um, but you're not getting individualized feedback on assignments, on writing assignments or tests.
Uh,
Um, but at least you get the live experience, or you could listen to it on recordings.
yeah.
So you get some of the value, some additional value that way, but you just wouldn't be getting the grading or the individualized feedback.
Hmm.
I mean, I
Yeah.
guess you could still do the assignments on your own, but they wouldn't be spending the time and resources on grading you and giving you feedback.
Yeah. So I guess that would sort of be, if I were to do that, that would sort of be what the value would for me would be, because I'm already sort of like watching courses, reading books, and like doing that sort of like making it objective by like creating content, writing stuff down with like my channel and my like independent studies. So I guess the value that I could get out of that would be like sort of having people to look at what I do and tell me if I'm doing it right or not. And I guess sort of that's what YouTube comments are for, but obviously the YouTube comments are not as intelligent as like as Onkar or someone else that would be evaluating me. So yeah, that makes sense. I guess if that I will definitely consider that with that in mind.
Yeah, it's yeah, get that expert feedback is valuable, and it
Hmm.
also could be valuable for giving you a kind of credential. I mean, depending on what your goals are in life, you might find it valuable. Like if you have third-party credentialing, I mean, it's kind of like
Mm.
you get a degree from a college, and part of the value of that is it makes objective to other people who don't know you from Adam that's
Hmm.
you've got some kind of something to prove that you've reached some level of understanding. So if you want to go on to be, if your goal was to be an objectivist intellectual, well, part of the way of demonstrating that you've actually mastered the ideas is to go through this program and do well in it.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it's a way of making objective to other people that
Hmm.
you've reached a certain level of understanding,
Yeah.
and maybe you could get that anyway.
Hmm.
But it's
I guess for me, for if I wanted to do that, I would just like sort of point to my YouTube channel or say, look at this and you can judge it based off that, rather than, I guess a credential could be helpful though, in the sense that like, yeah, this was independently judged by these intellectuals who we already know are good and good at what they do. And then they've said that, yeah, you've passed this course or you have this credential. So that could also be helpful in helping other people judge you.
yeah, it's kind of an independence evaluation. I mean, it's yeah. So it's one thing to say, well, I've got this YouTube channel, but okay, there's millions of people who have YouTube channels,
Hmm.
and within objectivism, not millions, but lots of objectivists, I think, have YouTube channels. So this would be a way to distinguish yourself if that were of value to
Yeah.
you, which it might be. It also might accelerate your understanding. So even if you could get to a certain level of understanding on your own, it might take you longer to get there than if you have experts to guide you along. So that's another thing. In addition to getting credentials that say you reached a certain level, you might get to that level faster than you otherwise would.
Yeah, for sure. It would be nice to like be able to like ask questions of these type of people and like try to like work through some of these issues. Like, yeah, if it'd be awesome just to have like Leonard Peikoff's email or something, so that like, oh, I have this question on objectivism. Like, why did you, or what did you mean in like the question that we were talking about earlier? What did you mean by you can't choose to focus, or there's no why when it comes to focus? And then what do you mean by later when you have this similar primary choice of life? And like, I could just ask this question and he could respond and we could talk about it. But yeah, it'd be nice, but that's not, I guess, my reality right now. I just have to sort of reach out to other people grasping with this question and sort of grasp at it as well.
Yeah, well, it's
And
not
sort of
my
try to figure out
reality
what he might
either.
mean.
Yeah, well, with someone like Leonard Peikoff, I don't think he's really active in philosophy
Oh yeah, yeah.
these days, at least not to the point where he would be, just taking questions like that from people. And he's not one of the OAC instructors
Oh yeah,
anymore.
yeah.
So yeah, you wouldn't be able to ask him, I don't think. I mean, you can email him and maybe he'll reply. I kind of doubt he would reply to that kind of question, but yeah, but you could deal with ARI's instructors at least to some extent. I mean, they're busy too, but you would have more access to them. You might also consider, I don't know if you're on HBL, Harry Binswanger's list or web forum, but you could raise this kind of question on HBL, and I'm sure some people would be game for discussing this issue and all kinds of issues. Not all of them are going to be experts or professional philosophers, but some of them might be. Harry Binswanger might engage on a question like this. So I think that's HBL is another good resource, which I use quite a bit myself. Not always posting, but I read it regularly, and sometimes I post.
Yeah, I like to read the like math ones on there. I'm
You're on
reading
it?
through the mathematical mysticism one. Yeah, I'm on there, but I haven't posted anything or asked any questions yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found lately that I've been very interested in like the mathematical application of objectivism. I've watched some of like Pat Corvini's lectures on this sort of stuff, and I bought Robert Knapp's book and have been reading through the Harry Binswanger stuff. I think he's gonna release like a book soon on something related to that, but I have no idea. I think James Elias told me that he was saying something about that, but I have no idea.
Yeah, he's I just remember that he said he's putting together a lot of his posts or articles from across the years, and he's assembling them into a book. And I don't know if he's gonna, like, to what extent he's gonna edit that or just pretty much leave it as the original posts, or maybe he'll just write like an introduction to it. I'm not sure, but yeah, that is a project in the works for him. I don't know when it's supposed to come out.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's exciting. More books are better. I have a lot of stuff to read. I'm almost done with ITOE though, which is nice.
Yeah, that's a really important one. Are you reading when you say you're almost done, do you mean the 8 chapters, or you mean the appendix? There's the long appendix.
The appendix. I finished the 8 chapters a while ago. I'm like mostly almost done with the appendix. I try to read 10 pages a day, and I think I have like 3 days left of reading. So
okay. Yeah,
it's
that's
exciting, good stuff.
I took a seminar on that many years ago with Harry Binswanger. We went through the entire thing, including the appendix. I mean, not all of it in equal detail, but we got pretty in depth into it, and that was a valuable experience.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Trying to think if I have anything else I wanted to talk about, but yeah, do you have anything else you wanted to talk about? I think we've gotten like almost 2.5 hours, so.
Let's see. No, I don't think on this call. I mean, there's other topics we could discuss another time, but we kind of had a theme here for this call on life
Yeah,
and
for sure.
happiness.
Hmm.
I think we covered a lot of good ground with that. So
Hmm.
yeah, I'm happy to to call it a call.
All right, for sure. Let's call the call.
All right.
Yeah. All right. So I'll just do a closing thing, and yeah. All right. So thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.